समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
We like very often to say anytime an Indian Prime Minister goes to Washington or a US President comes to India, the expression often used is this is the defining relationship of the 21st century. However, when you apply the same test to India's relationship with Russia or what used to be the Soviet Union, now it is an argument whether you want to say that Russia is the successor state of Soviet Union or not. However, essentially it's the same nation. How will you describe that relationship, particularly now as Putin comes calling for his 10th visit to India? 10th visit to India under different prime ministers, under Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Dr. Manmohan Singh and Narendra Modi, his third visit to India under Narendra Modi's prime ministership here. Meanwhile, Narendra Modi himself has been to Russia 7 times. He's been to the US 10 times. Those visits also include those sort of mandatory visits, semi-mandatory visits to UN General Assembly. However, those also include bilateral meetings. Now, this is a time, this has been a period of 25 years since India started making a move towards the West. India, first of all, corrected its Soviet tilt once the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and then it started moving more towards the West. In that period, all Indian prime ministers have been to the US often, Prime Minister Modi 7 times. However, shifts have taken place elsewhere also. So while in the Soviet era, Soviet Union and China, from 1963 onwards, Soviet Union and China had strained relations. In the next couple of years, those relations were completely broken. Until then, they were brotherly communist states. Then those broke up. That breakup generally took place around time India-China War of 1962 took place. In the war, the Soviet Union said that they were neutral, but really they were more inclined towards China, and then things changed. If Russia is the successor state of the Soviet Union, as many people in this country, our country also believe, in fact, at the popular level, if you held a poll, first of all, if you ask the question, which country is the most reliable friend of India, I think 90% people will say it's Russia. And then if you ask, is Russia the successor state of the Soviet Union? Chances are that 90% people might say yes, because that is the perception in the country now. Now, see how times change and how as times change, they remain the same. As Vladimir Putin comes into Delhi, this is almost to date 70 years since the first Russian leaders, Khrushchev and Bulganin, came to India. That was in November, December 1955. So 70 years from then. The leader who comes now from Russia is different. First of all, this is Russia, not the Soviet Union. Second, this is not a country run by the Communist Party. And third, this is not a pole in a bipolar world. It's a different world. It's a different Russia. And you know what? It's a different India as well. So all those equations have changed. It is in that situation that Vladimir Putin comes to India. We also need to note that in 1955, Nikita Khrushchev was the supreme leader of the Soviet Union, being the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the USSR. And Nikolai Bulganin was his premier or prime minister. They came top leaders. After that, big cooperation started, and in the course of time, among other things, 3 big steel plants were set up. That is Bhilai, Bokaro, and Vishakhapatnam and Vizag. That was the first phase of Indo-Soviet relations. By this time, however, in that phase, this was not a strategic relationship. That strategic relationship started after 1962. I told you in 1962, Soviet Union was ambivalent. A lot of the literature has come out later, researchers have written about it, that in 1962, if anything, Soviet Union might have leaned towards China, however, not very significantly. In the same process, because things were changing, it was in August 1962 that India and Soviet Union signed the agreement for India to buy their first MiGs, or first supersonic aircraft. Later, that was expanded. It was in 1963 April that the first MiGs came to India. That was the first big deal between India and the Soviet Union, and that's when a strategic partnership began to evolve. Then a co-production agreement was signed to make MiGs in India. In 1970, the first MiGs made in India came out. Meanwhile, India had started acquiring a lot more military hardware, and within the next 3 years, after 1965 war with Pakistan, when most of the equipment India used was of mostly British and French origin, almost immediately after the 1965 war, India turned to the Soviet Union as its main supplier of weapon systems. The 65 war was fought by India mainly with British and French systems, and a few made at home, and many inherited from the British from the Second World War era. The first order with the Soviet Union was T-55 tanks after the MiGs. T-55 tanks, order placed in 1964. The first tanks arrived in 1966, and then more orders were placed by 1971. By the time the war started in 1971, the T-55 tank had become the mainstay of Indian armored formations. In fact, India needed so many so quickly that all of those could not even come from the Soviet Union. So Soviets helped India get those tanks both from Czechoslovakia, as it was called then, and Poland. By 1971, India had a formidable T-55 tank force, Indian armor. That was the mainstay. Meanwhile, changes took place with Indian Air Force. MiG-21s were the mainstay of the Indian Air Force. Also, India sort of made emergency purchases of a large number of Sukhoi 7 aircraft. These were the ground attack aircraft Sukhoi 7s. The Navy also started buying Soviet systems. The Navy had found in 1965 war that it had still not entered the submarine era, and Pakistan had a long-range American submarine, a Tench class PNS Ghazi, which was very difficult to find those days. In fact, that's a submarine that was sunk off Vizag in 1971. Indian Navy now wanted submarines. Americans would not give them to us. The Brits would not give them to us. India turned to the Soviet Union, and that's when India started getting its first submarines of the Foxtrot series. Foxtrot is the NATO code name. These submarines came in 2 lots. The first 4 came between 1967 and 69. That is one each in 1967 and 68, and 2 in 1969. In 1971 war, India was fielding 4 Soviet origin Foxtrot submarines in India named Kalvari class. After that, 4 more came in what was called Vela class, in 2 in 1973 and 2 in 1974. For a long time then, Indian Navy's submarine force was fully of Soviet origin. Meanwhile, in the 71 war, the Pakistanis fielded the Ghazi, which sank, and they also fielded 3 Daphne class submarines that they had bought from the French. That's how the Soviets now helped India restore the balance underwater as well. Between 1971 until say around 1987, almost all of India's defense purchases were from the Soviet Union. What changed in 1987? By 1987, India had begun to see that the world was changing a little bit, and there were areas in which India needed equipment that may not have been readily available from the Soviet Union, and also there was a need to diversify its sources. So the Janata government of Morarji Desai first made a shift and bought the first bit of Western equipment in decades when they ordered the Anglo-French Jaguar. And then subsequently, Mrs. Gandhi, sort of in her last year, ordered Mirage 2000, the first copies of which came in Rajiv Gandhi's time in 1987. That's the reason I say by this time, India had begun to diversify its sources of weapons. But at the same time, because Pakistan was getting a lot of new weapons from the US as a payback for its support to the Americans and allies in Afghanistan against the Soviets, India also had to accelerate its purchases from the Soviet Union. And that's how the MiG-23s, the MiG-27s, also some MiG-25s, the Trisonics, and the armored fighting vehicles, BMPs, as they are called, Sarat in India. A lot of those came in, and also T-72 tanks. Later, India bought a large number of T-90 tanks, which are being assembled in India now. One of the public sector companies, which used to be an ordnance factory board unit in the past. In 1990-91, Soviet Union ceased to exist. It was succeeded by Russia. So there was still a power center in Moscow. However, this was a much weaker country than Soviet Union. It was not the other pole in the world, and that brought in the unipolar world as well. Now, India took time adjusting to it. Russia also took time adjusting to India. Many interesting things happened in that period. It was in 1993 that then President Boris Yeltsin came to India. For a while, say in 1990, 91, 92, India felt friendless. This was also the time when Pakistan was getting greatly strengthened by American help. It was also the period when India had a lot of internal instability and challenges of insurgency and terror in Punjab as well as Kashmir. And India felt at some points that it was in a way friendless because India had not quite turned to the West as yet. The West was very deeply tied with Pakistan anyway, given the Afghan situation, and also India, which had such a strong economic relationship with the Soviet Union. It wasn't just a military relationship, it was also an economic relationship that was gone because a lot of India's trade with Soviet Union was a privileged trade. It was done on rupee-ruble basis. A lot of it was barter. India had to make those changes. So after those couple of years, and the new Russia was also coming up, they had their instability. They were figuring out what kind of a nation they wanted to be. It was around that time that Boris Yeltsin came to India. And that is when the foundation of India-Russia relationship was laid, or let me say, that is when the transition from the Soviet era to the Russia era, and from the Cold War era to the post-Cold War era, or from the bipolar world to the unipolar world started in India's relationships with Russia or New Delhi's relationship with Moscow. Now, 1993, a very important thing happened when Yeltsin came to India. If I take you back to 1971, as Indira Gandhi was heading for war with Pakistan, she knew that the Americans were going to help Pakistan. They were going to help Pakistan strategically, politically, say at the UN, diplomatically, but probably also militarily by holding out a threat. So she wanted to hedge her risk. Now, India's relationship with the Soviet Union had been deepening and widening in the previous 3-4 years. I told you India was buying more and more MiGs. India had bought the Sukhoi 7s. India was also buying submarines for the Navy, and India was buying tanks and artillery guns for the army. All that was coming from the Soviet Union, but she wanted something formal to basically tell the Americans that, look, I've got somebody who has my back, and that somebody is as powerful as you, at least militarily. That somebody could have only been the Soviet Union, particularly because by this time, China and America had come together. The two rivals of the past had come together. That was a friendship brokered by Pakistan. So Pakistan became a common friend for both of those powers. The superpower, the big superpower, America, and a rising power or a large country and an Indian adversary in China. So she saw the need to formally hedge that. That is what led to the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation signed on 9th of August 1971. Remember, within 3 months of that, within 3.5 months of that, a proper war started between India and Pakistan. So that was just on the eve of the war. Now, the important thing in that treaty was Article 9, Clause 9, or I would say Article 9. I will read Article 9 to you. Each high contracting party, that is diplomaties for nations, each high contracting party undertakes to abstain from providing any assistance to any third party that engages in armed conflict with the other party. Which means if, say, Pakistan is at war with India, then Soviet Union will not help Pakistan, and maybe if the Americans or the Chinese attack Soviet Union, India will not help them. That is the simpler part. Next, and that is the more important part, in the event of either party being subjected to an attack or a threat thereof, the high contracting parties shall immediately enter into mutual consultations. And it's not just consultations. See what the consultations lead to. Mutual consultations in order to remove such threat, to take appropriate effective measures to ensure peace and security of their countries. Which means the moment a war breaks out, the two countries will meet and they will discuss what can be done to fight off this war together. Not said quite in that many words, but the summary I'm giving you is right. In 1993, when Yeltsin came to India, by that time, his Russia was not as powerful as Soviet Union of the past. And India also knew it, the whole world knew it. So this Article 9 became infructuous. India and Russia in 1993, that is Narasimha Rao and Yeltsin, signed a fresh treaty. This was called Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation between Republic of India and the Russian Federation. In this one, some minor changes were made here and there, but this Article 9 was dropped. So Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, speaking at Tricena Dialogue 2 years back in 2023, he said, you should remember that the only country in the world with which you have a signed formal strategic treaty is Russia. He was right to that extent. Only thing is, he did not remind you, and why would he, of the fact that this Article 9, which was really the heart of the treaty, the original treaty, that had been dropped in the 1993 version. However, from then, Indo-Russia relationship began to grow again because Russia was still a big power, and besides other things, Russia also made some of the finest military equipment in the world. Also, it was willing to sell it at very reasonable prices under special dispensations to India. Among the first big purchases made by India from the Russian Federation was the Sukhoi 30 fighter, Sukhoi 30 MKI as it's now called, and which played a stellar role in Op Sindoor. First advance for the purchase was made by Narasimha Rao when his government was headed for elections and when he had become a caretaker, and there was a controversy about this. Should a caretaker government have paid that advance? That is something that I wrote a national interest on, of which I will share a link with you. The basic story there was, as it turned out later, that as Narasimha Rao was headed for elections in India, so was Yeltsin in Russia. The plant that made Sukhoi 30 was based in Yeltsin's constituency, and that plant had not been able to pay salaries for some time. The story was that Yeltsin requested Narasimha Rao, if he could pay an advance, then the factory will be able to pay its salaries, its employees' salaries, and that will be good for Yeltsin in his election. So Narasimha Rao paid an advance of $350 million. That became a controversy, which was later settled in a very healthy way between leaders of the BJP, the Congress party, and later also with Deve Gowda's government, where Mulayam Singh Yadav was the defense minister. Please do read that story. You can also watch that video. I am sharing both links with you. This is where a big turnaround in India-Russia relations took place, and that is how India and Russia were again taking their relationship forward, not quite to the same level as the Soviet era, because in the Soviet era, trade, even the weapons purchases were done at a very different level. There was a lot of aid element involved, which now was not the case with Russia. So India was paying cash to buy. Also, there was no barter anymore, and there was no rupee-ruble trade. This relationship then climbed upwards over the years. In 2000, when Putin came to India, remember, Putin took over as acting president on 31st of December 1999. So as we speak today, he is completing 25 years in power. Some of that as prime minister, but 25 years in power in Russia. 3rd October 2000, he came to India, and that is where India and Russia, in this case under Vajpayee government. The previous revision of the 1971 treaty was under Yeltsin and Narasimha Rao. Now this declaration on strategic partnership on 3rd October 2000 was between Vladimir Putin and Atal Bihari Vajpayee. Then 10 years later, it was up further. It was elevated further. What was declaration on strategic partnership now became a special and privileged strategic partnership. That's how it remains now. That happened on 21st December 2010, again during Putin's visit to India. This was between Putin and Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh. So you can see Putin has maintained this relationship and enriched it through the tenures of many Indian prime ministers. Now we know about the many opportunities that India and Russia have. There will be many agreements signed. You are reading and you are watching all the names and all the pictures of the equipment that India might be either acquiring or wanting to acquire. India definitely wants to buy 5 more regiments of S-400s. Their performance was so stellar. At the same time, India wants to buy more long-range missiles for the existing regiments because some were consumed during Op Sindoor, but also they were so effective because the IAF has now figured in the course of Op Sindoor that they have the missiles S-400s. They give the IAF the ability to keep Pakistan Air Force really far back, say about 200, 250 kilometers inside its airspace. So in a way, it can impose a no-fly zone for Pakistan Air Force just because these long-range S-400s are available on this side. That's why they want more of those missiles. Besides the fact that they want more regiments, those orders will be placed not just now. First of all, Russia has to deliver to India the 2 regiments that are pending because 5 were ordered in 2018. While India waits for these regiments, however, India wants to order more long-range missiles because that becomes a force multiplier, as was evident in Op Sindoor. There will be discussions on Su-57, on the third non-nuclear weapon, nuclear-propelled submarine of Akula class. In the past, India has had a Charlie class that was called Chakra. Now you can call it Chakra 1. Then there was an Akula, Chakra 2. Another Akula had to come, which will be Chakra 3. It should have come by now because the agreement was signed in 2019. It is delayed now because Russians have had their own problems with the war going on for nearly 4 years now. The third Akula, therefore, will probably come in 2028. That is the first strategic issue with Russia. What does India buy now? And what does India buy which will attract CATSA sanctions that were imposed by the US and its allies after the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. That's why what happens in the war in Ukraine will be critical also for India's prospects on this big strategic aspect. Number 2, I'm listing the current strategic issues. Russia's rising relationship with China. In 1963, when the Soviet Union turned to India and India turned to the Soviet Union, they were made for each other because India was disillusioned with the West. Soviet Union, in any case, was at odds with the West, but now they were disillusioned with China as well. So they became natural allies. Now, Russia, under Putin, Russia and China have become very close. That partnership is now clearly defined as a no-limits strategic partnership. Remember, Putin had gone to China to meet Xi Jinping before undertaking the invasion of Ukraine. Looks like he exchanged notes with him or took him in confidence. That's a very special relationship. In the process, because Russia has become weaker or consumed by the war, its dependence on China has gone up. Its economic dependence, its tech dependence on China has gone up. And that is something that really worries India. So in a way, we are back to 1962 to some extent, when the USSR was ambivalent over India-China relations. Similarly now, this Russia will have its own issues with India-China relations. Most definitely, they will not be inclined to support India. At best, they will say you are two great powers in Asia, you should not be fighting. Again, we have to see what will happen in case India has trouble with Pakistan again, because Pakistan, for all practical purposes, is a Chinese protectorate. And this Russia's dependence on China is quite acute. The next point, and that is where Russia will be and is impatient with India, that is India's ambivalence on Ukraine. Now, the Western world wants India to condemn the war, call Putin the guilty party. Similarly, Putin, on the other hand, says, if you are my friends, you should not be so ambivalent. You should be more supportive of Russia. Whereas walking that fine line, Prime Minister Modi has been saying, has also been lecturing him, saying this is not the era of war. In fact, at the last India-Russia summit in July last year in Russia, Prime Minister Modi also in public, on camera, talked to Putin and said how heartbreaking he found that children were being killed in Ukraine in air attack. That's a fine line that India is walking. And you can imagine that in Moscow, that will be the cause of some strain at the UN. The fourth point is supported the UN. Supported the UN, can India count on this Russia? They have the veto, they are a permanent member. Can Russia count on their support as much as was the case in the Soviet era? I think the answer is you better not ask that question, because a couple of times when these issues have come up, the Russians have been ambivalent. Next point, this Russia, because it also has economic needs, it needs trade, it needs to sell things, and weapons is one thing that it's got to sell at a good price, very good quality. It's been selling some critical systems to Pakistan. For example, the engines that go into Pakistan's JF-17 aircraft. Now, the Russians will turn around and say, we would offer these engines to you also. In fact, we might have offered these to you. You didn't want them. We wanted some market for these. But that will remain a stress point with India. However, the biggest stress point for India, and I'm sure this is the central point of the talks, and this will influence the outcome in many ways, is the very fact that Putin chose to invade Ukraine or launch what he calls as special military operation. What has it done to India? It has caused India many problems. Number one, it has strained India's relationship with the West. It has actually rocked the ship that had been moving westwards, the ship of Indian strategic policy that had been moving westwards for 2.5 decades. That ship has now been rocked because India is forced to make up its mind as to which side it is on, and India cannot take sides for many reasons. Number two, it has brought upon India now the wrath of Trump too. Although I think Russian oil purchases is something that the Western world wanted, that Europe wanted, that America wanted to keep global prices under a level, it has also not brought India that much of a lottery. So this saying that India has hit a jackpot and all, that is nonsense. India has bought slightly cheaper oil, but not that much cheaper. It's not a lottery. It's not a bonanza. This, however, has become an excuse for Trump to put that 25% tariff and also to generally show his annoyance with India. So that relationship is also under restraint because Trump also knows, Trump administration knows that India is torn between its critical dependencies on Russia and also its interests with the US. Third, this war has weakened Russia and made it more dependent on China. In fact, at this point, Russia is even dependent on North Korea and Iran. That's an area, those are areas where India cannot help Russia. Can India manufacture more 155 shells and export them to Russia? No, that's not going to happen. Nor is India going to sell them to Europe, because India cannot be seen to be taking sides in this situation. That's why this has really deepened India's dilemmas and constricted India's choices in this world. So what is the upshot finally? The upshot finally is not that India will buy these systems or those systems, or that India will get these RD-191M semi-cryogenic engines for its workhorse, ISRO's workhorse, GSLV. These engines will enable GSLV to carry heavier payload. So heavier satellites in geostationary transfer orbit. All of these are important. Generations of Indian military leaders have really found Soviet and Russian equipment useful because it is cheap, it is durable, it is easier on maintenance, and while it may not be that high-tech, it is more user-friendly and more destructive. So what do we say in India for something which is cheap, nice-looking and durable? Sasta, sundar aur tikau, right? To that add two more attributes to Russian military equipment. That is bhari or maru. It's heavy, and if it hits its target, that target really gets obliterated. And we saw some of that effect in Op Sindoor as well, as these BrahMos missiles went into Pakistani air bases and left those permanent markers of their superiority. And also the fact that Russian weaponry is heavy, it's effective. It may not be the top technology in the world, but if they fire 10 and 2 find their target, they will be very, very effective. I'll take you back to Op Sindoor and think about what really worked on Op Sindoor. What worked on Op Sindoor was the Sukhoi 30, MKI and BrahMos combination. Made in India, Russian origin, under license. One under license, the other in a joint venture. Or S-400 missiles. These were the game changers in Op Sindoor, all of Russian origin. That is something we must remember. In conclusion, I will tell you a little story. In 1985, I was writing a cover story on India's Defense Modernization for India Today magazine where I worked. That is when Rajiv Gandhi had greatly upped the defense budget and a lot of new things were being bought. That was also the time when Exocet missiles were in news because Argentinians had used it quite effectively against Royal Navy in the Falklands War, and Pakistan had just acquired Exocet missiles. As part of this story, I was given access for interviews to all three chiefs at that point. The Army Chief General A.S. Vaidya, the Air Chief Marshal LaFontaine, and the Navy Chief Admiral Tahiliani. So I was talking with Admiral Tahiliani and I said to him that look, Pakistanis have this Exocet missiles. Do you worry about them? He said, well, yes, those are very accurate missiles, very effective. But look at the Royal Navy ships that got hit by them. Most of the ships, some ships sank, but most of the ships that got hit by Exocet missiles were still able to sail back on their own power. My Soviet missiles, my Styx missiles from Soviet Union, maybe they will not be that accurate, but if I fire 6 and 1 hits the ship, that ship will sink right there. That ship will not sail on its own power or anybody else's power. That is the respect in which the Indian armed forces and their leaders have held the Soviet and Russian weapon systems.